Hi guys, it's Miss Owens, and today I wanted to talk to y'all about drugs and school and the consequences. And when I say drugs in school, I mean bringing drugs to school, selling drugs at school, using drugs at school, or buying drugs at school. And I want us to talk a little bit about what could happen to you if you had drugs at school and there wasn't something like the RJ program to go to. What would happen to you and what would the consequences be? So I want us to remember that no matter what city, no matter what state, any type of drugs at school are illegal. It doesn't matter if we're in Texas or New York or Colorado or California. Anytime that somebody has drugs at school, it's illegal. It's against the law. And all schools in the country, like I said, no matter where they are considered drug-free zones, which means basically if there's drugs in school, like inside the building, if they're inside of a car that's parked at the school or a bus, or if somebody is just carrying them and walking around the campus, it's illegal. It's against the law. What would happen if you bring drugs to school and you went to a different school is that legally, any school leader is allowed to search you if they think that they have drugs on you. And when we say search you, we mean they can search your person, which means like they could look in my pockets and my jacket if they wanted to. They could look in my backpack, or they could look in my locker. So if I'm found to have drugs on me, so if they check my jacket and I have drugs on me, or if they check my backpack and there's drugs, the school is expected to call the police. And once they call the police can kind of decide whether or not I would be arrested. And if I did get arrested because I was using drugs at school or selling drugs at school or buying drugs at school or even just like bringing drugs to school in general, I could be charged with something called juvenile drug possession. And there are some serious consequences that can happen if you are charged with juvenile drug possession. So, the first and like the least serious of all the consequences that can happen if you're arrested is that you can be ordered to go to something called drug counseling. Drug counseling is this expectation that you and sometimes even your parents have to go and meet with a counselor a certain amount of times a week for a certain amount of weeks, and talk about like why you're using drugs and talking to your parents about like how they're letting their children use drugs. And you might see a counselor like by yourself, you might see a counselor with your family, you might see a counselor in a group, and the expectation is that you go to all the counseling sessions, you pass drug tests. They were called random drug tests. So they could show up at school and they could drug test you, like the court could show up at school and drug test you. They can ask you at 2:00 on a Wednesday or 4:00 on a Friday. They can just test you whenever they want to see if you have drugs in your system. And so if you pass these drug tests, so you're clean, you don't have any drugs in your system for a certain amount of time, and you don't get in trouble again, the charge will be considered dropped, which means it won't go on your record. And so that's what drug counseling really is. It's like it's the least serious consequence you can get if you are arrested for having drugs with you at school. Another consequence that the judge might give you is something called probation. And probation is this idea that you can still live at home, but there's a lot of rules that you have to follow if you are to still stay at home. So a lot of times kids on probation who are charged with drug possession have to do community service, and the judge will tell you a certain amount of hours that you have to do. Those random drug tests that I was talking about will still happen. So a probation officer who's in charge of making sure that you follow all the rules can give you a drug test pretty much whenever they want to see if you have drugs in your system. You might have an ankle monitor, which is basically like a GPS on your ankle that they track where you go and make sure that you're not going anywhere where there's like known drug dealers, or that you're coming home at a certain time every night, you're sticking to a curfew, you're going to the places that you're only allowed to be going, like school, or if you have a job. Probation can usually last 6 months or more, and the charge can stay on your record, which means it doesn't leave your record, kind of like if you did drug counseling. And the most serious of all of the consequences that can happen to you if you get arrested for drug possession is that you would go to a juvenile detention center. And usually that wouldn't happen the first time you got arrested, but it would happen maybe, the third or fourth time that you were found bringing drugs to school, or that you weren't able to stick to drug counseling, or you weren't able to follow the rules while you were on probation. They would send you to something called a juvenile detention center, which is basically jail for kids. And in a juvenile detention center, you live there 24 hours a day. You don't get to go home. You go to school there. You only get certain times where your family can come visit you. You get certain times where you can call home or you can call your friends. And you live in a small room with a stranger, with somebody that you don't know, and you have to share your space with them. This can last at least 30 days, and you can be in there if you keep breaking the rules until your 19th birthday. And so I want us to think about how having a charge on your record, how can that affect you and your future? And so if you have a charge on your record, it can affect you in a bunch of different ways. So the biggest way that it can affect you is that anytime that you have to get background checked for something, so you're applying for a job, or you want to apply to college one day, or you want to rent an apartment one day, you're ready to live on your own, these places are allowed to check your record, check your criminal history to make sure that you have never been arrested for something or that you've ever been in trouble with the law. And if they see that you have a charge on your record, like drug possession, they can say to you oh, we don't want to give you this job because you're a criminal, or, oh, we don't want to rent you this apartment because we're afraid you'll do drugs in it, and those kinds of things. And I think what can affect you the most at your age is that schools can refuse to accept you if you have a criminal record. And so sometimes if you're trying to go to a different high school, or you're trying to go to a new middle school, schools can check your record and say, oh, this is a kid who brings drugs to school, we don't want them at our school. And to kind of close this out, I want us to think about how in 2017, almost 10,000 people under the age of 18 were arrested in Texas for drug possession. That's a lot of people. It's a lot of kids. And I want us to think about those 10,000 kids and how their lives have probably been affected by their choice to bring drugs to school or to sell drugs at school, and how their lives could be different if they were given the opportunity, being able to go to an RJ program instead of juvenile detention center, or instead of being on probation, what their life would look like. And I'm gonna really push you to think about, how are you going to take advantage of this opportunity of being given RJ instead of those other consequences? How are you going to learn and grow from this opportunity? And how are you going to ensure that this kind of choice doesn't happen again?